These are the 7 worst cities in America, folks. Places that are expensive, with deteriorating economies, with lots and lots of crime. If you're thinking of moving, you probably don't want to move to these cities. And if you already live there, you probably want to get the hell out. In this video, we're going to take a look at hard, objective data from sources such as the FBI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Zillow on why these areas, these 7 cities, have such a poor quality of life and why these are the worst 7 cities in America. I know a lot of you out there, you're looking to move to a new city, find a place that's affordable and growing. You're looking potentially to find a new place for real estate investment. If that's the case, you definitely want to avoid the 7 cities we're going to talk about on this list. So without further ado, let's get into the data. So many of you who follow me on this channel, you consistently ask 2 key questions. You constantly want to know these 2 things. You'll comment on it in the comment section here on YouTube. You'll send me emails. You'll message me on Instagram. By the way, you should follow me on Instagram if you haven't already. You'll ask me these 2 key questions. The first is, what is the best place to move to in America? I know a lot of you are looking to get out of the cities you're currently in, and you're looking to move to new cities that are more affordable and that are growing. The second thing that a lot of you ask me is, what are the best places to invest in real estate, where if I buy a real estate investment property, I'm going to feel secure, it's going to appreciate into the future. And for those of you who asked those questions, I wanted to make this video because there's some definite places in the US that I would totally avoid for both of those things, whether it's to move me and my family there or whether it's to invest in real estate. I wouldn't touch the cities we're going to cover in this video with a 10-foot pole. And why don't I like these cities for either living or for investment from real estate purposes? Well, it's quite simple. It's because these cities have what I call the ugly trifecta. Now, you might be wondering, what's the ugly trifecta? That's kind of an interesting, weird name. It's 3 things that you really don't want in a city if you're either going to live there or invest there. Number 1 is expensive, high cost of living. These are places where the typical home price, which is data that I get from Zillow, is very high compared to the typical local wages, which is data that I get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when you're in a city with really high home prices and rents relative to wages, that's really bad for society. It means that people locally are really struggling to save. They're struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to kind of make it and grow in society. And in addition, it also means that your real estate market could be highly overvalued if all of a sudden home prices are really high relative to wages. The second point that's problematic for these areas is a deteriorating economy. A lot of them, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, have very high unemployment rates, meaning that a lot of people who are looking for work cannot find work in these areas. Additionally, many of them have lost a lot of jobs, not just over the last 12 to 18 months during the pandemic, but also in some cases over the last 5 years. And if you're in a city where it's hard to find a job and people are moving out and losing jobs, that's obviously not good for the city as a whole or the real estate and housing market. The third thing is crime. These cities have lots and lots of crime, particularly violent crime. Murders, rapes, and burglaries. We're going to be analyzing violent crime data on these metro areas directly from the FBI to see which ones have the highest violent crime rates. And boy, it's not pretty in some of these areas. Now, if you guys stay tuned to the end of the video, I'm actually going to show you how you can access some of this data for yourself so you can figure out how your city is doing. But before that, we got to get into the 7 worst cities in America. So let's roll. We're going to lead things off with a city that all of you have heard of. Many of you have probably been to it. This is arguably the most famous city in the world, and it's one that has gone from a place that everyone wants to move to a place that everyone wants to leave, and that is New York, New York, which is of course spearheaded by New York City and Manhattan, the city that never sleeps, the Big Apple. Well, turns out that the Big Apple is kind of turning into the rotten apple over the last couple years. Economic prospects for New Yorkers have been deteriorating significantly, especially since the COVID pandemic. And over the last 2 years, the job losses in New York City are at their highest levels since the Great Depression. The unemployment rate across the metro area is 8%, one of the highest in America, indicating that if someone wants to find a job, particularly in the leisure and hospitality industry, they're having a very difficult time doing it. At the same time, if someone is lucky enough to have a job, they're going to have the privilege of paying some of the highest home prices and rents in America. In fact, the typical home price in New York is almost 10 times more than what the average worker makes in a year, making it one of the most relatively expensive places to live, not only in the US, but also the world. It means that if you do have a job, you're really struggling to save money. Most of your paycheck probably goes to rent or your mortgage. And if you don't have a job, you're struggling to find one. And this problem has gotten really bad over the last 12 or 18 months since the pandemic, where there's been a lot of stores shut down in New York City, a big exodus of office workers from New York. And unfortunately, it's not getting any better. Today in September 2021, only 30% of the workers who were going into the office office prior in the pandemic in New York City are going in today. So we're still 70% below our pre-pandemic levels of people going to the office on Wall Street and Times Square in New York. And until those office workers come back, New York City and all of its ancillary industries are going to struggle economically. Now, our next city, the sixth worst city in America, is nowhere near New York from a geographic or lifestyle standpoint. In fact, it's completely almost on the other side of the world. This is a city where it's a very dark place to live in quite literal terms, because actually during January and February, there's only about 6 hours of daylight in this area. And where am I talking about? I'm talking about Anchorage, Alaska. The lack of sunlight in Anchorage over the winter is extremely depressing, almost as depressing as the sky-high violent crime rates in the metro area. According to data from the FBI, the violent crime rate per capita in Anchorage is the highest in America. There's no other place where you have a higher chance of being a victim of murder, rape, or assault. More than 1 out of 100 people in Anchorage is a victim of violent crime every year, meaning that if you live there for any extended period of time, you very likely will be a victim of violent crime. In exchange for living in a place that's perpetually dark and with a lot of violent crime, you get a very mediocre economy. There's been lots of job losses in Anchorage over the last 5 years, as well as actually above average cost of living. The typical home price in Anchorage is $330,000, 10% more than the US average. And so you're actually paying a premium to live in Anchorage to deal with all these things. I know it's not a place that I would want to live. Our next city on this list is very similar to Anchorage in terms of a sky-high violent crime rate, but on the other hand, its climate is completely different. Instead of perpetual darkness and cold weather, we have perpetual sunshine and hot weather. Where am I talking about? Albuquerque, New Mexico. Most of you are probably familiar with Albuquerque through its portrayal in 2 shows, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, where you track characters like Jesse Pinkman, Walter White, and Saul Goodman rise up through the dirty, seedy underworld of Albuquerque in terms of drug dealers and gangs and crime. And it turns out actually that the portrayal of Albuquerque in these shows is very accurate, because the city, the metro area, has the 3rd highest violent crime rate of any area in America. So Anchorage is number 1, which we just talked about. Memphis is number 2. Albuquerque is number 3. And so if you work, say, in a convenience store or gas station in Albuquerque, you have a high chance of maybe getting robbed or held up, all for the privilege of earning $24 an hour, which is what the average wage is in Albuquerque according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A measly $24 an hour. That's one of the lowest in America. At the same time, the typical price of a home, while not overly expensive, isn't exactly cheap either at $270,000, while economic growth prospects are fairly mediocre with a 5.9% unemployment rate. Hopefully you guys are sticking with me so far. If you're enjoying the content to this point, make sure to hit the like button. When you do that, it gets these videos more exposure on YouTube and actually enables me to produce 1, more of this content going forward, and then 2, enhance the production quality. You'll notice in this video, this is the first time I actually have stock footage of these cities. I plan to do that more in the future now that I have a subscription to Shutterstock. If you enjoy that and you want to support the channel, make sure you hit the like button. So we got the first 3 cities out of the way, a big one in New York and then 2 small ones in Anchorage and Albuquerque. Now we're moving to the top 4, which is primarily large cities. You're going to pretty much recognize all of these areas, especially the 4th worst city on this list goes by the Golden City, the tech capital of the world, as well as the most expensive place to live in America. Where am I talking about? San Francisco. Put simply, people who live in San Francisco can't afford to live there. The typical price of a home in the Bay Area is $1.3 million. That's the highest in America, and it's actually 4 times higher than what the US average is. So we're talking a cost of living in San Francisco that is just astronomical and really has no comparison. Unfortunately, the wages in San Francisco don't come close to enabling people to afford these prices, because according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the typical worker only earns $81,000 a year, which means that that typical worker would need to earn 17 years of wages in order to buy their home outright. Remember that in America, the average is around 5 to 6 years of wages to buy a home outright. In San Francisco, it's 3 times that at 17 years. Additionally, the gas prices are super high, as much as $5 a gallon. The cost of food is super high. And so if you're the average person or the average family in San Francisco, you are not saving any money. You are really struggling. You're living paycheck to paycheck in a city that increasingly has deteriorating economic prospects. Lots of people have fled the San Francisco area over the last 2 or 3 years. It's in one of its historical downtrend cycles in migration. That means that the labor force has declined, and even though the unemployment rate of 5.7% doesn't look so bad, prospects for real economic growth and success, unless you work in the tech industry, are pretty much non-existent in San Francisco. And unfortunately, not only do citizens in San Francisco have to deal with the worst worst cost of living in America, as well as mediocre economic prospects, they also have to deal with the worst homelessness crisis in the US. Homelessness is absolutely rampant in San Francisco. I was just there 2 or 3 months ago. I filmed a video there for my YouTube channel, which you should check out if you haven't gotten the chance. And due to this high level of homelessness, as well as the fact that most people are struggling to make ends meet in San Francisco and struggling to survive, there's a very high level of theft. In fact, San Francisco has the 5th highest rate of larceny and theft in America. Roughly 1 out of 25 people in San Francisco in a year will be robbed, according to data from the FBI. And that's actually something I saw firsthand, because when I went to San Francisco 2 or 3 months ago to film that video, I actually met up with some friends who had their car broken into and $2,000 worth of items stolen within 2 hours of being in San Francisco. So this is a place that's extremely expensive, has a mediocre economy, and has one of the highest crime rates in America. I don't know why people choose to live there. Now, many of the people who do choose to leave San Francisco and the rest of California actually end up in the 3rd worst city on this list. This is a place that for decades and decades has been a magnet for people who move out of California, move out because of the high costs. But now, unfortunately, all of a sudden, this city, which used to be affordable, is becoming very, very expensive. Where am I talking about? Las Vegas, the city of sin. Las Vegas is a city and an economy that's driven pretty much solely by its leisure and hospitality sector on the Las Vegas Strip, which is a very low-wage and cyclical economic industry that is in a big downtrend right now. The unemployment rate in Las Vegas is over 8%, and tens of thousands of jobs have been lost since the pandemic, meaning that the average worker in Las Vegas is struggling to find a job. And if they do have a job, chances are the wages aren't high enough to afford the cost of living, because the typical price of a home in Vegas has gone from about $220,000 in 2016 all the way to $380,000 in 2021, a 67% increase. Meanwhile, the average hourly wage in Las Vegas has only gone up by 20%, from $24 an hour to $26.50 an hour over the same span. So we have the cost of living increasing at 3 times the rate of wages. That's not a good thing for a city, especially when there's also lots and lots of crime. Data from the FBI shows that Vegas is in the 80th percentile of violent crime in America. And that combination of deteriorating economy, high cost of living, lots of crime that we see in Las Vegas, it's also very emblematic in the 2nd worst city on this list, potentially more than any other large city in America. This is a place where local families, typical workers, average workers really, really struggle because there's no economic opportunity right now, and home prices and rents are absolutely ridiculous. Where am I talking about? Los Angeles, folks, the city of angels. This is a place where the typical price of a home is $837,000 according to Zillow. That's almost 3 times the US average, and it's the 3rd highest in the country. At the same time, the average worker in Los Angeles only earns $35 an hour, meaning that they need 13 full years of wages to be able to afford and pay for the average typical home. Now, I don't think it comes as any surprise to people that a place like Los Angeles is expensive. We know most of California is, especially desirable areas with good weather. However, the real problem that LA has right now is it's expensive while having a terrible economy. Los Angeles has the worst economy of any large metro area in America right now in the fall of 2021. Recent data from the BLS shows that the unemployment rate is an astronomical 9.1%. The US average is 4.8%. Los Angeles is 9.1%, meaning that people looking for work in LA can't find it. At the same time, the labor force has decreased significantly. Lots and lots of people have fled the city over the last 12 to 24 months, which is why this place is turning into a dystopia that's ridiculously expensive, but at the same time doesn't offer people any economic growth prospects. And before we get to the final city on this list, the worst city in America to live and to invest, I want to just address a point specifically regarding places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. These are obviously big international cities that have been around for a long time and are very expensive. However, the big difference that exists in these cities today is that they no longer offer economic growth prospects. The wages in these cities are not keeping up with the home prices, and the unemployment rates are skyrocketing, which makes living there as a middle class or lower middle class person extremely difficult because you have no hope of saving money. You have really no hope of climbing the economic and socioeconomic ladder. And there's a big divide in these cities between what the middle class person is feeling, the person earning the average wages, and what maybe the higher class, the wealthier class is dealing with. Because if you're in LA and you're a 5 million follower Instagram influencer and you're on OnlyFans, you might be loving it. You might be saying, life is great. I don't know what you're talking about, Nick, in this video. I love LA. Or if you're a rich tech person in San Francisco, you might think it's a great place to live. And so it's important to address that for people who are wealthy in New York, San Francisco, and LA, maybe they can find the nice the nice neighborhood that doesn't have crime, and maybe their job's remote, so they don't need to worry about the local economic prospects. But for most people, the average family or person, it's a really bad place to live. Now, with that out of the way, let's get to the worst city in America. And actually, guys, I've tricked you a little bit, because the worst city is actually not just one city. It's a bunch of cities in the same geographic area. Because when I was actually running these numbers on the different data and coming up with the overall ranking of the worst cities, I was shocked at how basically like 8 of the top 10 cities, the worst cities, were all in this same geographic region. And where am I talking about? I'm talking about California's Central Valley, which you can see here outlined in yellow, all the different metro areas. Pretty much all of these metros came up in the top 10 worst city list, which is pretty amazing to think that one geographic area could dominate this list so much. Places like Stockton, Modesto, Merced, Fresno, Visalia, Bakersfield. These are places with sky-high unemployment rates, expensive cost of living, and lots of crime. I mean, just take a look. In Stockton, the unemployment rate's 8.8%, but the typical home value is 11 times more than what the average worker makes, which means that Stockton is more expensive than Salt Lake City, more expensive than Austin, actually more expensive than Boston or New York relative to local wages and cost of living. Meanwhile, a place like Visalia has an 11% unemployment rate, which is absolutely off the charts, one of the worst in America, as does a place like Bakersfield, which has a 10.5% unemployment rate. One of the reasons these areas are struggling so much is they're still primarily agricultural economies. The Central Valley produces 25% of the food that America consumes and over 40% of all the fruits and nuts. Pretty much all of these areas are big into producing oranges, limes, almonds, pistachios, which is great for the rest of America. However, being a primarily agricultural economy puts these areas at a significant disadvantage in terms of long-run economic growth. Quite simply, the tech boom that's taken place in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, it has not spread at all to the Central Valley. They are still basically living in an economy from 20, 30, 40 years ago, and as a result, unemployment rates are perpetually high, and there's a lot of potential risk to the local economy. All of a sudden, if there's a crop shortage or if the price of food goes up, it really affects locals in the Central Valley. And the unfortunate thing is that the economies in these areas, despite not participating in California's tech boom, have to be subject to the same types of onerous state regulation that California exerts on pretty much everywhere in the state. There's onerous environmental rules, there's strict building codes, there's rent control. There's all these things which make the economy even less dynamic than it needs to be. Oh yeah, and on top of all of that, pretty much all of the metros in the Central Valley are above the 80th percentile in violent crime rate in America, particularly places like Stockton and Fresno and Bakersfield, which are particularly crime-ridden. And so let's run down this list one more time, folks, so you can remember the places that you probably don't want to move to or invest in real estate based on how expensive it is, how poor the economies are, and how much crime there is. These would be New York, Anchorage, Albuquerque, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and to top it all off, the Central Valley in California. If you're thinking of moving to these areas, I would caution you against it, given how tough the quality of life is. If you're someone that does already live in these areas, I would say maybe consider some other places in the US, because the thing to remember is that there are plenty of places in America that are great places to live with a high quality of life. And in future videos on this channel, I'm going to be covering those places. There will be a follow-up, the 7 best places to live in the US. And I know you guys are going to want to see that, given how many of you ask me questions about where to move and where to invest. So make sure you're a subscriber so you see that video in the future. Make sure you've also turned on subscribe notifications so you get a notification when I post that video. And I'm also really excited to announce, folks, that I'm going to make some of this data available that I looked at in this video available to you guys to look at for yourself. I'm going to take the data I have in Tableau, make it publicly available. If you want access to it, though, you need to become a channel sponsor member. Hit the join button below. There's also a link in the description where you can become a channel member. The cost is $5 a month, and you get some really cool perks. I have a monthly newsletter exclusively for channel members. It comes out once a month. The most recent issue came out last week. In addition, I'm going to start posting some of this data, making it available for you channel members to look at, because I know a lot of you want to figure out what's going on in your city. How does my city rank in terms of affordability, in terms of economic progress and growth? Maybe figure out some new places where you might want to live, places you might want to move or invest. You can do that by looking at the data that I'm going to provide to you. So once again, you can hit the join button below. If you don't see the join button, then make sure to go into the description, scroll down, and then there will be a link next to text that says channel member in all caps. You can also join there as well. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was a bit of a different concept for me. I want to do this more going forward. Top 5, top 7, top 10 lists of cities using the underlying data. Let me know if you like this concept. If you did, make sure you've hit that like button already, and make sure to comment below about, especially if you live in these cities, like what are you seeing? What are some areas that you want to move to in the US? I want to hear what your feedback is, so make sure to comment below. Until next time, this is Nick from eVenture Consulting signing off.